You ready?
Are we done?
Yeah, I guess we're ready.
Okay.
Alright, I'm gonna play a random amount of the time loop, which is already playing. You ready?
Sure. Is this your remake music?
Well, yeah, time warp.
Yeah,
We're
sure.
doing it again.
Well, no, I mean, it leads into,
Good afternoon and welcome to Cinema Smackdown, where we are also going to do the time warp again today. This is the kind of thing everyone's been demanding. A little chat about. What are we doing today, Shane?
We are doing remakes.
We're doing remakes.
Because they are a blight unto the planet, and we need to talk about this problem immediately.
Yeah, I mean, there's one out of every 200,000 that are not bad, but for the
Yeah.
most part, they're not a great idea.
Well, appropriate that you opened with Time Warp, because Rocky Horror Picture Show did get a television remake just, what was it, last year or the year before?
That's a very good point. Didn't they wheel poor Tim Curry out in the middle of that?
Oh, that
in a
was
wheelchair?
upsetting. That was...
I'll admit I have not seen it.
Yeah, I did, and that was tragic, I guess. I mean, the whole thing, it had fleeting moments of okayness, but given that it had been launched for a number of stage productions, it's valid to do another version of Rocky Horror Picture Show, but yeah, that TV movie remake was a bad idea all around, and wheeling out poor old Tim Curry to do one more appearance in it after he disavowed it years ago.
I heard an interesting anecdote last week that was related a bit more to sequels, but it applies to remakes. It was Steven Spielberg was talking to the marketing department right before E.T. was released, and he was and I heard this from the mouth of one of the marketing guys, and he said, Spielberg came in and he said, "Look, the honest truth is, this movie we're about to release, E.T., it's kind of a sequel to Close Encounters." He said, "But we don't want anyone to know that. Because as we all know, in 1982, sequels do half the business of any original film." Wow, has that ever changed?
So, by that standard then, that means E.T. is actually a shrunken down Richard Dreyfuss, much like they did in the Phantasm movies.
I do believe you're correct.
Yeah, okay.
That's a good insight.
That's my interpretation of the film from now on.
I do believe that Spielberg himself is the tall man, so that works for me.
Okay, well, these days. It's getting up there. He's about as old as Angus Grimm.
Oh, good lord. He must be. They've got to be comparable ages. I mean, and certainly with
I think
Angus
they're twins.
Certainly with Angus Grimm having stopped the clock at this point, I think Spielberg is rapidly catching up. He must be in his 70s.
I guess, yeah.
I mean, Ready Player One definitely seemed like the cutting-edge film a 70-year-old would make.
Yeah, there's that. We should mention that the whole reason we got onto this topic of remakes in the first place is because a couple days ago we were talking about remake news. Now, it's not a film, but of course everyone's buzzing about the fact that Netflix is going to be remaking Cowboy Bebop.
Oh, that's right.
As a TV show, a live-action TV show. And I smell the disaster from 100 paces away.
Well, I mean, it all depends just how much you revere Cowboy Bebop.
Well, like all good people, I revere Cowboy Bebop greatly.
Right.
So,
well,
the idea of catching that lightning in a bottle again, especially with an American sensibility, because Americans have such a great track record of remaking anything Asian.
Yeah, well, I mean, as you said, it will be absolute death if they skip what detail, Shane?
Music by Yoko Kanno.
Right.
They have to absolutely 100% hire Yoko Kanno to do the soundtrack, because Cowboy Bebop has the most amazing soundtrack ever devised for a television show.
You're not alone in thinking that. I know that's a very popular...
I estimate it as being fully half the formula for the success of that show. In the same way, I was trying to explain to someone just yesterday how, in the same way Star Wars doesn't work without the music. And he couldn't see it. It's like, no, Star Wars works fine without the music. No, it doesn't. There's two key reasons that Star Wars exists today. Oh my god, we're talking about Star Wars again. It always comes back to Star Wars, even if Tess isn't here. But
Tess, by the way, again, out on assignment today, doing a photo shoot for us. I'm not sure what the nature of that photo shoot is, but that's where she is.
I'm sure Well, we hope she'll capture Bigfoot properly this time.
Oh, by the way, I didn't really get to it, but let's do a quick introduction. Today is December, I want to say 9th?
Yeah, that sounds about right.
December 9th, 2018.
Check your advent calendar.
Our show is called Cinema Smackdown. My name is Michael Brody, and I am joined by my co-host Shane Simmons, and it appears that we are going to talk a little bit about remakes today, and maybe just ramble a bit into different directions. We'll see.
This stinks of a remake being a remake of an earlier episode. I don't know. Might well be.
Thanks for bringing that up. Not a bad idea. Let's do remakes of our previous episodes.
We could do the 10-part series about Marvel movies again.
Oh, I'm good. I don't need to redelve my. I think what with the release of the newly announced title of Avengers Endgame, worst title ever.
If only that were the end.
We're going to be seeing a 3-hour Avengers movie, and I think with that's plenty of Marvel material for the masses.
I think Avengers Endgame is going to get busted for false advertising in the same way that Friday the 13th, the final chapter, did.
You think?
Yeah.
Final chapter, The Last Straw, the Jason Goes to Hell. These movies, they were not well titled, I guess. That might be the way of putting it. Every single one of these should be a new beginning. Every one.
Well, they are pretty much remakes of each other, so.
That's a good point.
And they've all been remade since.
That's true. Well, I mean, certainly the horror franchises have no end of reboot/remakes, depending.
Yeah, it seems horror films are especially susceptible to remakes. And occasionally, very rarely, you get a good one.
Yeah.
But not often. Usually you get a toothless remake as opposed to an interesting remake.
Well, tell me a couple.
Well,
I've got my own list. Let's hear a couple of your list.
Well, the big ones that always come up are the what I consider the whales of the 1980s, which are all remakes of 1950s science fiction films. In that, it was the 80s. You could get away with much goopier special effects. So we had John Carpenter's The Thing, remake of The Thing from Another World.
Yeah, too bad that one wasn't any good.
Yeah. Truly a classic.
The movie upon which the concept of remake is based. Can you make it as good as this? If not, don't bother.
Then don't do a remake, yeah. But also of equal merit, I think, is David Cronenberg's The Fly. And the lesser-known one that everyone always skips, but I highly recommend it, is the 1980s remake of The Blob.
Oh, that's a good point. That is an excellent film. You can also throw into that grouping, but nowhere near as good a movie, but still weird and interesting, the Tobe Hooper's Invaders from Mars.
Yeah, that is a strange little film.
It is a very strange. If you want to watch people sucking on frogs, you're in the right movie.
Yeah.
But you're definitely right. The Blob is an excellent example of taking something and reimagining it.
Because I'm not a particular fan of the original The Blob. It's an okay.
There's not much to love
Red Scare era type of drive-in horror movie, whereas The Blob, which was at least co-written by Frank Darabont, who went on to do little things like The Shawshank Redemption. His talent is evident throughout that film.
Yeah, Chuck Russell.
The inventiveness is fantastic.
Worked on The Blob, and they worked on the third Nightmare on Elm Street movie, which is also.
It's also the good one of that series.
One. Yeah, it's certainly the first one with any good mood to it, a good feeling that this might go somewhere.
Well, it was the first one that embraced the idea of, well, we're in a dream world. Let's be inventive.
Yeah, I mean, unlike say the Friday the 13th or Halloween series, they gave their characters an opportunity to fight back in a way that they can't in those other films. That just you have to stick with we're killing children at the campfire formula. You can't really turn it into a dream warrior movie. It doesn't work the same.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, those are excellent examples of the 80s taking the 50s style and twisting it into, aside from the mullets, pretty good films.
And now what we get are remakes of 1980s films that are shallow shadows of their former greatness. Or they just don't even have the intestinal fortitude to match the grisliness of these 30, 40-year-old movies now.
Yeah, well, I have a couple of examples of that. Like these are recent remakes of 80s movies. So here's three. 3 movies that were remade from 80s films. Maybe the last one is from... Okay, my first example is the movie Total Recall, which might be 90? I don't remember what year that came out.
Oh, yeah, I bet that.
Anyway, late 80s, early 90s. It certainly has an 80s style to it. So, Total Recall, RoboCop, and Fright Night were all recent, in the last decade, remakes of 80s-ish films. And they're all flat. They're really flat movies. The Total Recall movie and the RoboCop movie... Well, the Total Recall movie is almost a shot-for-shot attempt to remake something. In fact, relying almost entirely on you having seen the first movie just so that they can bait and switch you in some scenes. Hey, remember when Arnold Schwarzenegger walked out of the airport in a lady costume? Well, we're going to have someone who looks exactly like that lady walk out, and then Colin Farrell will run out behind her. Just so the audience goes, I know who... Wait, there he is. They got me. Terrible. But I mean, that's not. You're not telling a story at that point. You're literally just making an add-on to something I've already seen. The RoboCop movie is actually very, very far from the source material. It doesn't really tell the Peter Weller, Paul Verhoeven RoboCop Alex Murphy story. It tells a very different corrupt cop turning into a cyborg story. And so you're mostly abandoned by the concept at a certain point. It is a guy who's half cyborg who is walking the streets in a sleek, much less interesting looking costume because they give him a black suit in this. However, a couple of times in the RoboCop remake, they do callback lines of dialogue, which are just pulled from the original film and used in a different way in this movie. And in every case, the line makes no sense whatsoever unless you remember it from the original film. The most bizarre of all is the usage of the line, "Dead or alive, you're coming with me." It is a completely different meaning in the new film. Not a better one, much more of a head-scratcher, but extremely strange. Also, they use that line pretty much in the climax of the movie at the last possible moment you would ever want to be taken out of the film and reminded of something else. So, great job, new guys who made a RoboCop sequel. And I was mentioning Fright Night. The Fright Night remake, which stars Colin Farrell again. That guy is all over the place in the best remakes. Total Recall, this.
Bit of a rut.
At any rate, Colin Farrell is the vampire in the Fright Night remake, and they make this cardinal sin error in the first 20 minutes of the remake of Fright Night. They don't introduce him in the film. There is no scene in which you're watching the movie through the eyes of the teenager and go, oh, I get it. Here is where we, through the eyes of the teenager, see this strange action happening and are introduced to the odd neighbor who might turn out to be a vampire. In the remake, they pretty much just go, hey, look, that dude's a vampire. Who? That guy? That guy standing there? Yeah, him. He's already a vampire. We're establishing it. Get used to it. It is terribly paced. Just the worst. And speaking of terrible pacing, let's cut in for a moment and do a quick commercial and get to enjoy that sort of thing. I'll just make sure the button's actually on. Yeah, the button's on. And here we go with...
Frozen Peas? Tell me it's Frozen Peas.
About 62 seconds worth of Frozen Pea commercials.
Your upcoming event at an affordable price?
Wasn't on.
CJLO's got you covered. From on-air ads to website banners and even live broadcasts, we got it all. Check out www.cjlo.com/advertise for more information.
Oh God,
and the ways
who
we can
still
help
does
you
that?
promote your event.
We do.
CJLO,
Have to tell people www. No, please, no one. Skip that part. It's.
Do you want to have a discussion about movies?
We've got a big 30 seconds left.
Mm-hmm.
When we come back, you can talk about something.
And have the
Sure.
iconic sounds of cinema?
We'll tune in to At the Movies with iconic sounds every Tuesday from 8 to 9 a.m.
Only on
Shall
CJLO
do the,
1690
we're back with-
AM in
Yeah, yeah.
Montreal with your hosts Remy.
And Danny.
And we're back. Good afternoon, everybody. You are tuning in midway through Cinema Smackdown with Michael and Shane, and we are discussing... What is it again, Shane? I've already forgotten.
Remakes. Yay, our
Remakes.
favorite things.
Hey, this was your genius idea. You better show a little enthusiasm.
Well, no, we're about holding them in horror and shock.
Well, tell me a couple of horror or shock ones for yourself.
Well, I'm gonna do that thing I do. You know that thing I do. It's time for a
I
history
thought
lesson.
we would never tell anyone about that.
It's
you
time for a
feel-
history lesson, kids.
All right, let's history lesson it up.
So remakes are almost as old as film itself. It didn't take long for stuff to start being remade, and the primary reason a lot of the earlier films got remade was because they had this new technology called sound. And they said, oh, well, we've made a number of classics already, but it would be so much better if we could hear the actors talking. So when sound rolled in 1927, by 1930 it was generally standard fare. And the new wave of remakes began almost immediately. And among the remakes was this interesting phenomenon of what I would call instant remakes. Because a lot of films for foreign language markets, they started to double shoot them. So there's two versions of the same film, but with different actors, shot almost on the same set, sometimes same props often.
Ever with the same director?
Not. Yes, actually, yes.
The only
There
one
was.
I can think of is not the same director.
Blue Angel with Marlene Dietrich was at the Stroheim
So I
film.
take it that means they would reuse some shots, but not the dialogue shots.
In that case, well, it was the same cast because they were English and German speakers, so they were able to double shoot two versions with the same cast. The more famous instant remake was Dracula in 1931, which had a Spanish version shot for the Mexican audiences with a whole new cast, a new director, but all the same sets, all the same props.
And it's largely considered the superior film.
With the exception of the casting of Dracula himself, you can't beat Bela Lugosi. But they had the benefit of seeing the rushes of the English language version that Todd Browning was shooting during the day.
So what you're saying is that they were cheaters.
Well, they would look at the footage and they go, well, how do we do this better? And then they would proceed to do it better. They also had fewer restrictions about what they could show. So the dresses could be more revealing. They could have rats being scary in a corner rather than armadillos, which is in the
Lugosi version has armadillos?
Yes, they were not allowed to show rats. Rats were considered too horrific.
Oh, for the days of the MPAA.
But they said, oh, screw that Mexican audience. They can deal with the rats. That's fine. But so they substituted
you mean
armadillos.
El rata.
So yeah, it was a brief phenomenon because this was with the advent of sound. You couldn't just change the intertitles like you could with silent films. And this was before anyone had the bright idea of, well, let's just dub it or let's have subtitles.
Bizarre.
And so yeah, that's and they said, okay, well, we'll need new versions of this. We'll need new versions of that. Dracula, of course, had already been made in 1922 in a copyright-violating version called Nosferatu. There had been a 1910 version of Frankenstein, so they also shot that in 1931. Much more blown-out production as opposed to, I think, the original Frankenstein from 1910 that runs about 10-15 minutes tops.
So there's a Wizard of Oz in the same nature.
There was a Wizard of Oz, silent film of Wizard of Oz, and of course Ben-Hur.
The crazy thing is, even in that short, totally different actress, the one who played Dorothy, still looked stoned the whole time. It's a little Judy Garland nudge there.
Poor Judy.
We're picking on Judy. That's right.
Well, and then of course now we have she was involved in one of the many versions of The Star Is Born.
Oh yes,
which we're still getting.
Which is interesting because the initial versions of A Star Is Born is about acting, and then in what was it, the 19? I'm just
right. Then it became, hey, let's hire pop stars to do a singing
music,
version of this.
And then they started remaking that over and over and over. It's really interesting.
Because you have to constantly recreate that magic of Chris Christopherson and Barbra Streisand.
Well, they did recreate it because I may have already said this on the air, I don't recall, but in the new Star Is Born starring Bradley Cooper, I don't care that there's literally a scene in the film where Sam Elliott tells Bradley Cooper, you stole my voice. The reality is Bradley Cooper is doing a Chris Christopherson impression. Sam Elliott seems baffled by this, so he just claims it's his.
But we all want to be Chris Christopherson at heart, don't we?
There's a really sobering if anyone out there even knows who Chris Christopherson is, he's a he's a delightful bearded country singer who took up acting at a certain point. In the early 70s, or mid-70s, I guess, he hosted Saturday Night Live in maybe the first or second year it was on, and I still remember him coming out on stage, doing his opening monologue, and literally saying, I'm a singer. I can't act at all. So please give me the benefit of the doubt while I do some sketches tonight. I know I'm going to be terrible in these. And I like to think of that as Christopherson's entire acting career.
Yeah, and sure enough, the next thing you know, he's being hired to frontline gigantic budgeted films.
Well, isn't he in
Heaven's
The
Gate?
Longest Yard or something as well?
Is he?
Isn't he?
Oh,
He's in one of those Burt Reynolds football movies or something.
Okay,
like
well,
that.
I was thinking Heaven's Gate as an example of...
Yeah, no, Longest Yard is the prison one. I think he's in a different one where they're not quite in prison yet.
Okay.
Yes, of course, Heaven's Gate, the infamous...
because that didn't have enough strikes against it, they said, hey, let's go with Chris Christopherson.
Let's make the darkest, most unpleasant Western of all time, spend years, go tens of millions of dollars over the budget that we were already given that was extremely generous. Cast people no one wants to see as leads.
That was the brief period before Hollywood realized Michael Cimino was insane.
He was pretty insane. Yeah, I even kind of like Heaven's Gate. It's a strange, bad movie that sort of has an interesting tone to it. But it was a massive failure to the point that it took an entire movie studio down with it. It cost so much money that they pretty much leveraged their studio against it. And when it didn't perform, away they went. I couldn't tell you which studio it was right now, but it may have been MGM at the time. I mean, they eventually came back, but it was probably a partner.
Yeah, it might have been that would have explained why their whole library ended up on sale.
The one piece of movie trivia I like to mention whenever anyone mentions Heaven's Gate is the movie Waterworld, the Kevin Costner film from around 1995, because Waterworld is considered to be this gigantic bomb of a film, because it wound up costing an absolutely obscene amount of money by $1995. It was a $200 million movie, which is still, even by today's standards, is insane, but they wouldn't normally put it towards an aquatic, although they did this month, an aquatic hero film that doesn't look like it's likely to succeed. But what I like to bring up is the fact that Waterworld is everyone's favorite example of a movie that failed, while the reality is Waterworld succeeded and made a tidy profit. And so calling it a bomb is really strange. It is just considered to be that movie that didn't work that everyone is annoyed by, and yet the people who invested in that film made out like bandits. So I think it's only a cautionary tale in that people wanted it to fail, at any rate.
And just to bring it back on topic, Waterworld, little-known remake of Casablanca.
In a way.
Although that does bring me to my next topic, which is the stealth remakes.
Alrighty.
Remakes that are like, oh, surprise, this is a remake of something. Bet you didn't know that. Mm-hmm. And speaking of Casablanca, there is a remake of Casablanca that's a stealth remake. Mm-hmm. You may know exactly what I'm talking about. It's the film that you'll sit through the whole film, and until you're in the last scene, that's when you realize, oh my god, this has been a remake of Casablanca. I am, of course, talking about the Pam Anderson vehicle Barbed Wire.
High class film.
Classy indeed.
I don't think it was that hard.
If you were
to
thinking
know that
of
was a remake until then.
if you had a hard time watching Casablanca and not picturing a stiletto wearing, cat suited Humphrey Bogart wielding guns, Barbed Wire is for you. Also, in the stealth remake territory, I like to mention Clint Eastwood's Pale Rider, which is one of his westerns. Oh, here's another Clint Eastwood western. At no point do they really draw attention to the fact that it's a remake of Shane.
It is, in a way, a remake of Shane.
No, it's not in a way. It's definitely a remake of Shane.
Well, to be clear, the entire movie, the entire running time of Shane, you don't really get the impression he's an avenging ghost, do you?
Yeah, well,
that is the Pale Rider.
That is the Pale Rider thing that Clint Eastwood, in keeping with his resurrection theme that runs throughout most of his westerns, he is literally back from the dead. They don't really hit the nail on the head with this. They don't shove it in your face. But if you're paying attention, you realize, oh yeah, he's an avenging spirit. Yeah. Whereas Shane is merely ambiguously dead at the end of his film.
True.
But there is...
Well, let's be clear. Not everybody understands that Shane is ambiguously dead at the end of his film. A lot of people just think he's riding off into the sunset, having his next adventure. Which explains...
Well, it's a happy 1950s ending.
which explains the guns of the Magnificent Shane, the sequel, or what was the other one called?
The Magnificent Shane rides again.
There we go. Yeah, not real sequels.
No. Although Magnificent Seven has been unfortunately remade. Actually, there's good.
There's a real good bad.
There's
remake.
another great segue for the other kind of remake I want to talk about, and that's the genre skipping remake. Mm-hmm. So Magnificent Seven, aside from having a recent, expendable
very
Magnificent Seven Western remake, it was also remade as a science fiction film by Roger Corman called Battle Beyond the Stars.
Oh, that's a good point. Not to mention, if we're really talking about it, it's an inspired by a remake already of Seven Samurai.
Yes,
We're
yes.
going down the line of things
so
this
from samurai
rips
film
off
to
and-
Western to science fiction movie. In the science fiction movie, they're recruiting 7 alien races as opposed to just 7 gunslingers or
It's
7
been an
samurai.
extremely long time since I've seen Battle Beyond the Stars. I remember liking it, but now that as a slightly more mature adult, the Roger Corman brand has diminished a little for me. So,
Well, apparently it was classy enough that Robert Vaughn decided to sign on for it
well,
after being in the Magnificent Seven.
that's Robert Vaughn for it. He doesn't play the same character, does he?
He essentially does.
Oh, does he?
Kind of, yeah. He's one of the 7. Also in the samurai genre skipping, so my favorite example is Yojimbo, classic Akira Kurosawa samurai movie, remade as what turned out to be the launching point, not literally the first, but really the launching point for the spaghetti western genre. It's Fistful of Dollars. So from samurai film to western, and then finally to gangster film.
But let's be clear before you say that.
Yeah.
The original Japanese film is based on an American crime novel. By Dashiell
Well,
Hammett.
it's somewhat inspired, but
The point being that
there's 50 different
let's-
things that are inspired by Red Harvest.
Pretend the Red Harvest inspired Yojimbo, which inspired the Spaghetti Western, which then went on to inspire a 1930s gangster story starring Bruce Willis called Last Man Standing.
Yeah.
At this point, we've come a little bit full circle in
A bit,
what the
but
remake is.
I think, much as I'm a fan of Red Harvest, I think it's over-credited as source material for a lot of things because it's
true,
a specific
it's
story.
It's a pretty similar
It's
structure to a lot of
the
things.
structure is basically, yes, a guy plays one crime syndicate against another crime syndicate to get what he wants.
But let's be clear, that's a pretty specific story. It's like Lone
Yeah.
Farm Boy goes to fight the Empire. It's gonna
Oh,
you're
well.
pressed to point that that's not at least somewhat connected.
Yeah.
Guy two crime
Keeping in mind
syndicates.
that Dashiell Hammett kind of used the same general idea for a story in The Glass Key, another one of his books. So it's not the most unique concept in that even Dashiell Hammett himself reused it.
Back in the day, Dashiell Hammett, a fabulous writer. If you get a chance to go and find a nice old paperback copy, definitely give his work a read. The Glass Key is a great book. Red Harvest is a great book. The Thin Man is a great book. But back in the day, Dashiell Hammett, he was a big radio listener, and no station tickled him more than CJLO 1690.
Actual fact is he suggested the topic for this show because his book, The Maltese Falcon, got remade multiple times until the famous version with Humphrey Bogart came out in 1941. There was actually 2 film versions of that before. So the famous Maltese Falcon is a remake itself.
You're listening to CJLO 1690. Our show is called Cinema Smackdown, and we are currently debating the merit of good and bad remakes, films that amused us or horrified us. I'm going to mention a couple here that they all fall into the same category. These are recent remakes. Some of these are French films that were made into English films. Some of them are, one in particular was a Spanish movie, and a couple of them were actually American movies that just got remade. But they all fall into the same category, and that is movies that worked just fine originally, that they remade lighter. They remade them with less oomph, less of really an artistic sense of anything to say at all. So I'll mention a couple of titles. They're in the American films, and these, by the way, these are all genre horror movies. They all fall into this. So there's the recent remake of Flatliners, which is an extremely odd retelling of the story that is just so much less of everything. It's a very gentle version of that story. It barely feels like a horror movie at most points. There's also the remake of Poltergeist, which is almost shot for shot, and yet just every major moment in Poltergeist just falls flat in this version. I feel really happy that Sam Rockwell got paid, but I wish he'd gotten paid for anything other than this. It's quite a poor film. There's one more in that, which is the movie Carrie. They remade Carrie, the Stephen King story that was done as a Brian De Palma movie. And I do recall that they were working on remaking it for many years. It was a lot of people's project. They wanted to get that out there. And they said the big thing they really wanted to do with Carrie is they wanted to remake it more like the book. He said, well, De Palma had a particular spin on it, which is a little different than the novel itself. He added some shock moments and changed a few things around, changed character motivations. Probably did that thing where he combined characters into one character, different people. So they said, we really want to make sure that if we're going to redo it, let's do it a little bit different. So they remake the movie, and at the last minute, they essentially just go back to the movie script. They shoot scenes that are identical from the original movie that have no bearing on the book.
Well, because you want to give people exactly what they expect.
Yeah, and then I watch the movie, and I think, well, if you're going to steal, I mean, at least I can be positive you'll steal the shock ending that De Palma created out of whole cloth for his version, and you get the last 10 minutes, and they don't do it. They don't do the shock ending.
Huh.
Yeah, that's my big spoiler, is they don't copy the De Palma ending.
Just everything else.
It just makes the movie make no sense as a creation. But it's, like I said, it's a much lighter
See,
film.
I was almost a fan of the TV movie remake they did in the 90s.
Yeah, you might want to revisit it. It's terrible.
Well, I think it's fine until, because it's a TV movie
It's a
remake,
pilot.
they try to pilot it.
Yeah.
So the end leaves it open-ended for the continuing wacky adventures of Carrie White and her buddy.
Just a couple more on the same vein. So I just mentioned those are the American movies. So I'll mention two French films. These were very recently remade. They remade Martyrs and a movie called Inside, à l'intérieur. These
Two
films,
extremely horrific films.
yeah, these are French extreme new wave horror. They are beyond violent, beyond gory. They will challenge you as a viewer. Even horror movie fanatics find these films a little bit hard to get through. So they both
Whereas
get
I
off.
thought they were entertaining as hell.
They're both entertaining movies. But they both get remade by American companies with American stars, and they still make them crazy violent. And yet, you watch them, and they're just a little muted. They're just toned down. They just turned down the sound a little bit. Took some of the most violent things and turned them into quieter moments. Took some of the shock value and just deadened it a bit. You watch these movies, and they just feel like somebody trying to direct something with their hands tied. So they don't really work as remakes at all. They fall a little flat. It feels like everybody's compromising for the whole production. I find very similarly, not a French film, a Swedish movie, Insomnia. What was that from?
Yes, Insomnia.
Is it Swedish? Danish? It might be Danish. At any rate,
No, I think it's either Sweden or Norway.
It's a Stellan Skarsgård movie.
Yeah.
But they remade it with Al Pacino.
Yeah.
And it's not a great
It's the
remake.
soft version of it.
And it's softened.
And this is by no lesser a talent than Christopher Nolan. And yet, even, he can't do a remake without doing the wimpy, the wimpy version, the cheapened version of it.
One more to mention, just really quick, is the Spanish film Rec, R-E-C, which is the
yes.
for Record, which they did remake as nearly a shot-for-shot film.
Yeah, that is really close, that one.
But it is
Quarantine.
entirely missing the point of the ending.
Yeah.
They cut just enough information out of the last 10 minutes, while still staying very close. They cut just enough information out to make you go, yeah, I don't get it.
Yeah, the concept doesn't work anymore.
I don't quite get the ending. It doesn't quite work. And yeah, they call it Quarantine. And here's a spoiler for you. Well, just don't watch the trailer. They literally show you the last 10 seconds of the movie in the trailer, which is the biggest crime you can ever commit in film. Don't show
the
people
last
ending.
shot of the movie is in the trailer.
Last shot of the movie. They did the same thing with the remake of The Vanishing. They do show in the remake of The Vanishing, and this is a strange choice. There are two movies that came out in the 90s that were remakes of Scandinavian films. There was The Vanishing and, what's that other one called? Night Watch. They're both movies that are extremely dark and extremely well-made films in their countries. that were brought to America and remade by the same directors.
Yeah.
And the fascinating thing is...
Who destroyed their own work.
Well, in one case I agree, in the other I don't, but I seem to be alone in this. In the case of The Vanishing, they took a nearly perfect horror film and had someone who saw the movie say at the end of the movie, "Wow, I loved this so much, but what happens next?" Question mark.
Would this be better with an epilogue that makes it a happy ending?
Yeah. So The Vanishing, the trailer for the American Vanishing shows you the climax of the original Vanishing. It's in the trailer.
Uh-huh.
So when you see that scene come up in the movie, it has no punch whatsoever. But also the fact that after the horrific climax of the story, the movie keeps going for 15 minutes because we need to save all the heroes.
Mm-hmm.
We could possibly end a movie in a dark way.
Yeah, it desperately looks for that happy ending.
However, the movie Night Watch, I have seen both versions, and while the original version is a less, and I mean this in a positive way, it's a much less slick film, I really enjoyed the reworking of the script in the remake. I find that it has a much more effective last 20 minutes. The suspense at the end of that movie really works for me. However, I will again repeat that the movie Night Watch is not well liked. I'm not talking about the Russian movie from the last couple of years. This movie is from 1999 or 98.
Right.
It stars Ewan McGregor and a young Josh Brolin showing his first signs of actually having that element of an actor where hey, there's something about this guy that makes him seem interesting and menacing. He kind of has that Heath Ledger Joker thing in that movie.
Hmm.
So why don't you give me another example, Shane?
Well, I was going to say the phenomenon of filmmakers remaking themselves.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, I just did two.
Goes
So
back. Well, my favorite example is Alfred Hitchcock remaking himself as in The Man Who Knew Too Much, and he himself said of the original one, which he made in England in the 1930s, as opposed to the Jimmy Stewart film in the 1950s. He said the original was made by a talented amateur. And much as I enjoy the Jimmy Stewart version, I like the original better.
Well, the original, just not to get into spoilers, it's a more uncompromising ending, for sure.
It's a more and if this is your thing, it is a much more female empowering version, the earlier 1930s version.
Yeah.
The female lead of that, they established that she is an Olympic sharpshooter, and at one point, her sharpshooting abilities are called out of need. It's like, hey, why don't we give the person who knows what they're doing with the gun, and she uses it to good effect. And I love that ending. And it's not
not even remotely.
Yeah, Doris Day singing doesn't really make for as gripping an ending for me in the remake.
Well, when it comes to remakes, que sera, sera.
Indeed. Wah, wah.
I always like to bring this quasi remake up because it is so strange that this happened. There is a Korean film called Old Boy. It is a favorite of many people.
We're going to fight over this one.
I'm not going to the one you think I am.
Oh no?
No. Anyway,
we get into arguments about
not really,
because I of course am an enormous fan of the original Park Chan-wook film, and you defend the Spike Lee remake
somewhat. Actually, I just mostly don't love the original. You have to talk right into them.
Yeah. Whereas we both know that the real best version of that is the Bollywood remake.
Oh, I haven't seen that one.
If you see Old Boy, the first thing that's going to occur to you is, oh, you know what's really missing? Songs. This needs more singing.
So was there
to go with the hammer fights?
Was there ad campaign something along the lines of, if you see one Old Boy this year,
it's got to be the Bollywood version.
No, just to get back to what my actual anecdote was about, or my actual thought, Samuel L. Jackson was a huge fan of the movie Old Boy. He loved this film. He's a big Asian cinema fan of all sorts, and he loves Korean movies. And he's been very vocal about his love of different kinds of cinema. So he was very vocal about loving Old Boy, which explained how in 2012, Sam Jackson signed on to a movie called The Samaritan, which is a blatant ripoff of Old Boy. He plays the same lead character going through the same problems, who has an incarceration thing and comes out and meets a mysterious woman, not to get too deeply into it, it is the identical movie. So Sam Jackson decided, well, I'll never get to be in the actual Oldboy movie, so I might as well star in this $10 ripoff. However, 2 years later, Spike Lee remakes Oldboy, and who's in it? Sam Jackson. So he's in 2 different Oldboy remakes.
Not in the lead, though.
No, but in the other one he's in the lead. In The Samaritan, he's clearly the lead, but in this he's just one of the jailers. I marvel at that kind of, let's call it chutzpah, being willing to take this sort of thing on.
Sam Jackson is not always that picky about what he'll take, because also in the Asian remake...
How dare you?
Also in the Asian remake, friend, he was in that live-action version of Kite.
Yes, or as I call it, Kite.
But no one over here seems to know how we're going to pronounce that particular film, but...
that wasn't a good choice either.
I am a fan of the anime. I've shown it to people, but I have to say, oh my god, just based on the trailer is excruciating.
Yeah, it's a tough movie to get through.
I couldn't bear the idea of even attempting to sit through that actual film.
Well, Alfred Hitchcock's The Man Who Knew Too Much was made by a talented amateur. This movie is made by a rank amateur.
Who should never work again.
No, unfortunately. At any rate, Sam Jackson... just to mention Sam Jackson's... how much Sam Jackson works, I recently, while doing trivia, used the Nicolas Cage fact of how many movies is Nicolas Cage credited with being in. Now, we all know Nicolas Cage is obscenely prolific. He makes too many films. He makes too many cameos. Nicolas Cage has been in, officially, at this moment in time, he's been in 95 movies, according to the IMDb. And he is considered a massive hack who does too much.
While we were on commercial break, he came in here and shot an entire film in his studio.
He did. And meanwhile, Samuel L. Jackson, whose credits I spied yesterday, I believe he's at something like 113. And that's insane to me. That's a lot of little moments.
But 93 of them he's playing Nick Fury.
That's a good point. He is racking up those Nick Fury cameos.
So also in the anime to live-action Western film arena, which is why I'm so worried about the Cowboy Bebop remake, we recently had Ghost in the Shell. That panned out well.
There were no controversies there at all.
That is a film, the remake that is the sort of film that holds its audience in such contempt. Mm-hmm. It has to spend much of the first scene of the movie explaining what the title means.
Oh, it's awful. By the way, that movie did not do enough to tarnish the brand because Netflix announced this week that they are going full steam ahead on a new Ghost in the Shell series. I think it's animated, but regardless. It means that the brand isn't totally dead. And speaking of brands that are totally dead, let's do a quick commercial.
It'd be funny for...
Attention, rockers, psychedelinauts, punk freaks, and guitar geeks.
It'd be funnier making fun of the commercials if they weren't for other shows.
I didn't go with the movie show this time. I feel like we've done enough movies.
Uh-huh.
But we're going to be back in 10, 12 seconds.
Okay.
It's a real, like I said, super quick one.
Yeah. What's our time?
You got 15 minutes.
Mm-hmm.
I got way more than enough material for that, so I'm not worried.
Sure.
But if you got good stuff, I'm going to do our Where We're From Again thing.
Yeah.
And we're back on Cinema Smackdown CJLO 1690, and today we are discussing the complex concept of remakes, good and bad, the ones that
mostly
are
bad,
soft, the ones that are just wrong-headed, and the 1 out of 1,000 that are much better than the original, or at least interesting enough to exist. Once again, we've got John Carpenter's The Thing, David Cronenberg's The Fly, and that's almost where the list ends. I'm sure there's more, but it is really hard after that.
Well, I'll give the Bond series credit for finally giving us a proper, semi-proper version of Casino Royale.
Mm-hmm.
because the 1967
Only the third
comedy version,
the third version,
because there was also the live television adaptation of it in the 1950s.
Which,
with
if
Peter
you can get
Lorre.
your hands on, kids, don't. It's excruciatingly slow. If you've ever wanted to watch Baccarat played in real time...
It's only an hour. It is live television, and it has Peter Lorre as Le Chiffre. So that alone...
It's a little long.
And it's a live 1950s TV show with a torture scene in it. Come on. You got to give it credit for that.
I don't recall the torture scene. Is it awesome?
It's... For 1950s television, it's harsh.
I mentioned at the top of this, after the ad break, that we continuously mention John Carpenter's The Thing. The interesting point about John Carpenter's career is that nearly every major movie he's made, and even some of the minor ones, they keep getting remade. Let's just give a quick list of movies of John Carpenter's that have been remade or are on the verge of being remade. So, Assault on Precinct 13 was remade with Ethan Hawke and Gabriel Byrne. The Fog was remade with the guy from Smallville. Good call, guys. Great remake. Halloween has arguably been remade a number of times, depending on how you look at it. They have been threatening us with remakes of Escape from New York, Big Trouble in Little China, and They Live for decades. This topic keeps coming up. Every time a new action
As long as they don't touch my precious Prince of Darkness, I'm fine.
Yeah, that one no one's interested in.
That's good.
Yeah, don't worry. Martin Quatermass's script is safe.
They'll never do a better version.
No, that's not, and it's unnecessary to even go there. But regardless, every time a new action star is christened, what's going to happen next? Well, I'm going to be in the new Escape from New York movie, or I'm going to be the lead in the next version of Big Trouble in Little China. How did these films keep getting brought up into the mix?
See, for me, the only true continuing adventure of Snake Plissken is not even Escape from L.A., it is Captain Ron.
I agree. I like to think of it as a very strange pre-apocalyptic prequel.
That's the one where his eye grew back and then his other one fell out because the eye patch switches sides.
I mean, it's a movie. We could just say the film is swapped.
Yeah, that's...
I didn't even mention it, but one of Carpenter's movies has also been remade, and that is The Thing. And they didn't bother trying to rename it. They simply call it The Thing.
It is officially a prequel.
Yeah, but it's not. Watch that movie. It doesn't make sense for
it totally makes sense as a prequel. It's what happened at the other installation.
Remember before we made the John Carpenter movie, The Thing?
I'm not defending it as a good film, by the way. I'm just saying.
Remember when the aliens, they didn't look real at all, but were just terrible digital
Remember when that dog showed up in the camp and there was a helicopter chasing it and they were shooting at it? Well, here's the backstory of that. Yes, and that's what that film is.
But it takes all of the structure of Carpenter's The Thing. It takes all of the character arc stuff. It takes the solving of the puzzle of how to figure out who the Thing is. It takes all of that and does its own shitty version of it.
Look, we know it was doomed to never work if they didn't hire Wilford Brimley.
Agreed. Yeah, that guy.
That he's the gel that holds that entire film together.
Everybody in that movie is the gel that holds that movie together. I have multiple other people's filmographies that have been remade to mention, but do you have anything a little more poignant that you'd like to bring up?
Well, no, I was going to ask you, what's your least favorite? Because I have a couple of contenders for, oh my god, least favorite remake of all time. The most insulting. The one that gets it the wrongest.
I would go with any movie after the first Highlander, because even though they aren't officially remakes, they're sequels that cannot exist based on the rules of the first film. Does that work for you? Let's have sequels to something with a closed story that can't be reopened, that we don't try to reopen and just go another way with. The sequel to Highlander is literally, hey, I know we didn't mention this in the lore of the first film, but they're aliens? ? That's the dumbest film ever made. I mean, you could take literally any movie you've ever seen and say, we're going to make a sequel to this, and the twist is we're going to find out in the sequel they're actually aliens the whole time in the first one. Like, what if Back to the Future 2 was, it turns out Marty and Doc were aliens, and that's how come they could time travel? Mm-hmm. Not a great movie. All right, let's hear it.
I'm going to give 3 quick awards here.
All right, let's hear it.
All right, so worst recasting of all time. As we know, they tried really hard to find some sort of replacement for Peter Sellers after he died. And then finally they decide, oh, screw it. Let's stop trying to make sequels. We'll just make a remake to the Pink Panther, and we'll get Steve Martin. Why Steve Martin accepted this role, this impossible role to try and follow Peter Sellers, I have no idea.
Yeah, but you are forgetting there were 2 or 3 other people. Who
Oh yeah, no. Alan Arkin was the first to have a go at it, and
that was during Sellers' role.
It was in a long period of no Clouseau films. And someone else had the rights to make a Clouseau film.
So what you're
they
telling
said,
me
hey,
is
Alan Arkin.
Alan Arkin is the George Lazenby of the Pink Panther series.
Yes, absolutely. In the category of... Oh, yes. Worst slavish remake. Someone who's like, the original is a masterpiece, and I don't want to tread on its toes. Of course, we have Gus Van Sant's Psycho.
I don't know what you're talking about. I've been waiting my entire life to see Norman Bates's madness exemplified in a masturbation scene.
Right.
Because, as we all know, if he could have masturbated, he wouldn't have killed anyone.
Yeah.
Sort of the point.
It's a shot-for-shot remake, but occasionally, in that moment, let's insert a new sound effect of squicking as Norman plays with himself while he's spying on Marion Crane.
Oh dear.
Cows.
Cow
The cow shots. There's a few moments in that film that diverge from the original, and every time he does it, it's so jarring. You kind of go, "What is going on in your head?" What? My favorite being that when Julianne Moore realizes suddenly, for no reason whatsoever, that she's forgotten her Walkman.
Right.
It's like, why is this in the film? I don't understand. You've broken me. The funny thing is, with the exception perhaps of Anne Heche, it's an excellent cast. Most of them went on to be much bigger stars in later years, like Viggo Mortensen and
yeah, and had Viggo Mortensen played Norman Bates, I might have actually liked the movie. But they got Vince Vaughn, who I will defend in other films, but not in this. He is, and I use this on occasion to describe certain actors being cast in things. He's flavorless in that movie. It doesn't work. He has way too much baggage when he shows up.
I had to be reminded years later. Oh yeah, that was Viggo Mortensen, by the way. I was like, oh right, he got famous.
Yeah.
Because back then he was, I mean, of course we're both big fans of him in The Reflecting Skin.
Yes.
But he had acting chops, but
forever for him to break.
It really did.
And amazingly, the only reason that people know who Viggo Mortensen is today is
because he was in a little remake called.
But it's because while the film had already begun shooting, it is only because the actor they cast flaked out on set and had to be immediately replaced by the first person they could find who fit the bill. And that's when they brought Viggo Mortensen in, because somebody suddenly realized that acting in The Lord of the Rings meant a 5-year commitment, or 3 to 5 year commitment.
Yeah, you're just embarking on this epic, gigantically expensive thing, and Stuart Townsend flakes out on you.
Yeah, he just suddenly had this realization that he was going to be much more famous than this if he could just get out of his contract somehow.
And look how well his career's taken off, and look how Viggo Mortensen's dropped into obscurity.
Stuart Townsend has continued to just show up in places and seem like he seems to be having an odd little interesting career. Much like, I can't think of his last name. It's Doug something. He was in the second Mission Impossible movie, which stopped him from being able to do Wolverine in the original X-Men movie. His time on one movie ran over, and he's a British actor. His first name's Doug. Play at home, kids. And at any rate, he couldn't make it in time to start production on X-Men, so he had to be replaced by Hugh Jackman. And the actor I'm talking about, he still works. He's everywhere, but he never broke through.
I am still pulling for my original Wolverine choice when they recast it. I'm still dying to see, as Wolverine, Danny DeVito.
Well, he has the right height.
Exactly. Right height, right attitude. He's our man. And then my final award has to go to just worst ill-conceived misunderstanding of the source material remake. And that would be 2000's Get Carter, starring Sylvester Stallone, remaking the classic 1970s Michael Caine British gangster film. It is a film that, I think, as far as it understood the original film, it knew it had a cool theme to, a theme song to it. The Get Carter theme is a fun little jazzy piece of music. So they co-opted that for the remake. and then proceeded to screw everything else up, especially the ending.
Doug Ray Scott, by the way.
There you
For
go.
those of you playing at home. I hate not remembering names, and it's my own fault for not continuing.
And you should be
Doug.
ashamed because Cinema Smackdown is his favorite radio show.
That is true. I mean, it's right here on his IMDb page.
Didn't he text you today to ask you what we're talking about today?
Yeah, I mean...
He always does.
The guy's incorrigible when it comes to movie trivia. I mean, it's just how it is. Let's mention a couple of other interesting remakes, because we have 3 minutes left. So, I mean, not everyone realizes that some movies are remakes. For instance, 12 Monkeys. It's a remake of a 1 hour short.
Not even an hour.
No?
Like
I thought it was about an hour.
30. It's about 35 minutes.
Man on Fire with Denzel Washington, also a remake. These are surprising films. It's odd. This is a real quick one. Tony Scott was a young director in 1987 when a movie called Man on Fire was being made, and he was up for the part of director. It wound up getting made with Scott Glenn as the lead,
right,
and didn't hire Tony Scott. He was in the running, didn't get the job.
And apparently never let that go.
Never let it go, because 20 some odd years later, he resurrected the same, I would call it fairly mediocre screenplay, and tried to shoot it again using Denzel Washington.
Yeah, unfortunately that was when he was in his hyper-stylized
Yes,
phase, and
unfortunately,
so
it's not my
there's a
favorite.
solid break in his career when he just went over the top with the stylized stuff, and all the films he made right up until the end were garbage at that point.
Well, I think we should try to wrap it up a little bit now. Let's talk a little bit about you, Shane.
Me?
Is there a rumor that in the near future, in a few months, you have a new book coming out?
I am working on the edit of Epitaph, which is the sequel to my urban fantasy book Necropolis. Available on Amazon.
What year did Necropolis come out?
Let's see. Officially 2017. Yeah.
All right.
April 2017.
That's pretty good, actually. A year and a bit. You're not doing too bad on books.
Yeah, well, considering I have a lot of these I want to pump out.
Well, Necropolis is available on Amazon, and whether that's Canada or the U.S., I highly recommend it. I read the book. I did help edit it, at least copy edit it. And, Shane doesn't tend to take my suggestions when it comes to rewording things.
Well,
But,
I won't fight you as yeah, that's a typo. You're right, that's a typo.
At any rate, it is a lovely novel, and if you start reading now, you should be done just about in time to get the sequel, which is, believe it or not, a better novel than the first novel, at least in my opinion. So far, I am really enjoying it. I am about 60% of the way through the book, and I love it.
So if there's any delay on release, it's your fault.
It'll definitely be my fault. I myself am, as of next Sunday, taking over the hosting duties at Trivia at Grumpy's, downtown Montreal, 1242 Bishop Street. There will be trivia tonight. I will not be hosting. Tonight is the final night for Lauren Reynolds. She is going to go out with a bang. I'm going to be there to see it. Next week I take over, much like King Ralph. I am the last person in line for the throne. I have been your host, Michael Brody. I have been ably joined by my co-host,
Shane Simmons.
and this has been Cinema Smackdown. We will be back next week
With a remake of this very episode.
That is correct. Take care, everybody, and have a great day.
For CJLO News, I'm Luca Caruso-Moro.
Ooh, that was good. I didn't think I was going to hit the news just right, but I
Huh.
did. That was almost bang. Perfect. I guess we're not doing another show. Meaning they're not doing a show.
Right, right.
Because they ain't here. Just double check that everything looks right.